All right, so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about AI in general, because there's a lot of things going on. Some things I'm excited about, some things I'm skeptical about. And then at the end, I have a little bit of preliminary results on microbial ecology stuff. And I try to tie it all together with this idea of world models. And I'll explain what that means. Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. So first, I want to talk about a little bit about why I'm excited about generative AI methods. These are all these new machine learning techniques, which I'm using in my research, which focuses on applying these techniques to scientific applications. I want to define the area of world models because it's one of these key concepts in AI that isn't really in modern AI systems yet. And then I want to talk about applications of machine learning and world models in the sciences. And I have some examples from weather and climate, because that's about half of what I'm doing these days. And then I have a project with Nicole on microbiome modeling. So the first thing, one of the things that's been happening in the last few years is this generative AI term. This refers to both the language models, which everybody's played with ChatGPT, but also these image generating models, which you might not have had as much experience with. They're a little computationally expensive, but you can still play around with these for free, and they're being incorporated into PowerPoint and Google Slides and everything. You can generate images for your slide deck. But with these techniques, you can just type in something that you want to see, a cat in a hat eating a burrito. That's very little information, and it'll generate a bunch of images of cats in hats eating burritos. This is from, I think, 3 years ago, and they've only got better since then. But I want to emphasize that essentially the model, this is a machine learning model that's sampling from the space of all cats in hats eating burritos. And there's an infinite number of these images that could be generating, and you're sampling from this very complex distribution. And this distribution is over a very high dimensional space. These are 1,000 by 1,000 pixel images. Each pixel is 3 colors, and so it's a 3 million dimensional space. Defining a probability distribution over a space like that and learning a probability distribution from data is, that's been a dream of statisticians and machine learning people for a long time. We have these new techniques that allow us to do that much more efficiently, and that's a real technological advancement that's very useful for a bunch of applications. So one of the things people have been doing with this in the sciences is super resolution of images. So you have some low resolution microscope, you take an image of a cell, you can use these image super resolution methods. Instead of giving it text, you give it this blurry image, and it can produce some higher resolution of a cell. These systems can be pretty brittle. So this is from a 2021 paper in Nature, kind of highlighting the potential problems with this. So if you give this cell image super resolution image of a cat, it'll think it's a cell and generate some cell organelles in the cat. So I plugged this into Midjourney, which is the thing I showed in the previous slide. And it can go even further. And then if you keep going, you can get really crazy images that look cool, but are not scientifically useful. So all of this to say that we have these very powerful image generating techniques. You need to know what they're doing and use them responsibly, because otherwise you'll just end up with junk. Something that happened, if you extend this to videos, video is just an image with higher dimensions. This is from the most recent image generating or video generating model. Sora 2 from OpenAI. You just tell it, give me a figure skater performing a triple axel with a cat on her head, and it produces this pretty realistic video. Like if I saw this, I wouldn't immediately suspect that it's AI. So. So I want to emphasize that all of these are really kind of basic machine learning models that are just modeling data with a probabilistic model, like the same type of statistical models that we use in science all the time. And I think a really good example is the basic language model behind ChatGPT is just, the basic idea was described in 1948 by Claude Shannon, who, in this paper invented the field of information theory. But he basically just said, okay, we're going to build a probabilistic model of language. We're going to model each word, and we're going to use the chain rule to break up, the probability of observing this sentence is just the probability of observing first the word the, and then the conditional probability of observing cat in the hat after the word the, and then you can keep applying the chain rule of probability, which is always true. This is like a mathematical fact, until you get, it's just a product of seeing each word conditioned on the words before it. So this is basic, probability that you learn in a math class. And then the basic idea here is that all we need to do is model what is the probability of observing some word given the previous words. Claude Shannon actually built little dictionaries by hand in his paper, and he samples from his language model after looking at a book and saying, okay, what is the probability of observing this word after these previous words? But now we just use neural networks, and we can train on the entire internet to build the simple statistical model. If you're familiar with logistic regression, it's not too much more complicated than that. You could build a language model based on logistic regression, but it's a little more complicated because you have more parameters in these big neural networks. But that's all it is. And then once you have this, somebody types in the prompt in ChatGPT, you condition on that prompt, and then you just start generating words from this model. And that's how ChatGPT works. It's super simple idea that's been around for a long time. Now we have the computers to be able to train on the whole internet, and it's surprising how much you can do with this basic model. Any questions on it? Yes.
So should we conceive it just simply as like a majority decision, or?
Yeah, great question. So this gives you a probability distribution over words. If you only choose the most likely word, you end up generating kind of boring answers. So what happens is you sample from this distribution, and so every time you type in a prompt, you end up getting different answers because you're sampling from this.
But which are determined arbitrarily or according to the prompt?
Randomly. Well, because you're conditioning on the prompt. So maybe the prompt is the.
Right.
And so you're sampling from, okay, how do I complete this sentence?
Right.
Given the. During training, you're trying to maximize the likelihood of the data under this model.
Okay.
But when you're generating samples, you have your prompt, you have some probability distribution of the first word of your response. You sample from that set of words, and then you generate the next word using the same technique.
Thanks.
There's some extra tricks to get high probability answers and make it more efficient, but that's the basic idea. Is there another question? Okay. So a key component of this, many people are, when we when people talk about machine learning, many people are familiar with this idea of classification, where you plug in an image into a model and it tells you hot dog versus not hot dog, or cat versus dog. That's a classification problem. The ChatGPT language models are also just classification problem. The number of classes is the number of words in your dictionary. Typically, it's 10,000 or so. You also include periods, spaces, these other characters, and you call them tokens because it generalizes this idea of words. But it's a basic classification problem, and you can get these probability distributions out of your deterministic neural network prediction in this clever mathematical way. So the neural network is all deterministic. It outputs these numbers. You force these numbers to sum to 1 using the softmax function, and that gives you a categorical probability distribution over your set of classes. So this, gives you a probabilistic model that you can then sample from. So it's easy to see how, relatively easy to see how a classification problem like this can be probabilistic using these deterministic neural network functions. But if you think about generating an image, that's a lot more complicated. Well, it's not as obvious how to do that. And one of the big advances in the field in the last few years, I would say 10 years, is figuring out how to define complex probability distributions beyond, a simple Gaussian distribution or a categorical distribution, such as a distribution over images. So here's one way that you could do that, just to kind of give you a sense of, how this could be done. So in language, you have a sequence of text and you're generating 1 word at a time. You can do the same thing with images, where you're generating 1 pixel at a time. It's very slow, but it works. So this is a paper from 10 years ago. You take a bunch of images, you train this model on images to be able to predict the next pixel in the image. And then if you say you can hide part of the image and you say, okay, model, fill in the rest of the image for me. So this is your prompt, this is your response, analogous to a language model. And every time you do this, you get a different sample of the image, and they kind of make, sense. The problem with this is that it's very slow. You have to generate 1 pixel at a time, 1 color at a time, and that's not really efficient. So the modern image generating techniques use a few tricks. These are known as flow-based or diffusion models, where you basically learn a mapping from a known distribution, like a standard normal. You know how to sample from this distribution, and then you have a neural network that defines some mapping. It's called a flow from any sample in this normal distribution to a point in this more complicated image space distribution. And you do that in multiple steps. So what it looks like, you sample this blurry colored image, which is a sample from a Gaussian, and then you take many, many steps to reach the image. So if you look in really low dimensions, this is a simple explorer where this is your samples from a normal distribution, and then you have this data distribution, and you given just these samples, you can learn a mapping from this known distribution to that. And that allows you to sample from this complicated distribution, because all you have to do is sample from the known distribution, and then run the flow forward. So just to give a concrete example, let's see. So I can define this is some data set that I'm creating. And I can run this training just here in the browser. So this is the model training. So it's learning how to model this two-dimensional data. And I'm going to say that's good enough. And then when I want to sample, I sample from a normal distribution, and then the model that I learned maps my sample to one of these positions. And this allows me to sample from this complicated distribution. But also, if I have a point here and I want to know the probability of this point, or the probability density at this point, I can do the inverse mapping to get it corresponds to the probability of its source over here. So there's other methods in this two-dimensional space. We could have just done kernel density estimation, or even fitting a mixture of Gaussians. These are all methods for fitting data. Clustering, unsupervised clustering. But in really high dimensional data, this becomes really difficult. In image space, this becomes very difficult. Kernel density estimation no longer makes sense. But these other methods scale well because you can leverage some of the techniques of neural networks. So this is just showing a little more mechanistically what this actually looks like. So each step in this process from a normal distribution to an image distribution is a big neural network, which takes in a blurry image and then produces a slightly less blurry image. The mechanics of training this are actually really simple. You take an image, you add some noise, and then you have the neural network predict the less blurry image. So the training is actually quite simple. The math behind why this works is a little more complicated. People are still figuring it out, but it's hard to argue with the results. So this is basically the dominant technique for all these image generating models and video generating models that are so impressive. All right, so this is all to say that there's a lot of progress in machine learning, especially with high dimensional data and big data sets. So all these are kind of grouped under generative AI because you're generating things that are easy for people to consume: text, video, images, also audio. It's unsupervised, which means there's no labels. So previously, if you wanted to use machine learning, you needed a nice labeled data set where you have some input and some output, like class labels. And a lot of work went into generating those labels, often through hand annotation. These generative AI methods tend to be unsupervised or self-supervised in that you're just learning models of the data. Labels, it's still useful to have associations between different examples for many applications, but if you just want to generate images of cats, all you need is a bunch of images of cats and you can go wild. But for science applications, this still requires lots of data, and it's less interpretable than many of the mechanistic models that we have in the sciences. But nonetheless, there's lots of potential applications for this. So I'm going to talk about some of the applications that my group does, but first, I want to talk about some of the limits of what AI is doing. And for that, we need to talk a bit about agents. So in standard machine learning, you tend to think about just one-off predictions or one-off data generations, like generate an image once. Agents, with an agent, you're talking about something that interacts with the environment multiple times. So a simple example of an AI agent is this NVIDIA car from 2016. And it's surprising how simple the system is. It just takes in an image of what the camera in front of the car sees, and then it just outputs what action to take: turn, accelerate, or brake. So this was kind of a one-off thing. NVIDIA is not in the autonomous vehicle business, but they built this thing just to kind of demo the technology. And it works surprisingly well. They had a video showing of it driving on the highway and stuff. But I want to highlight that this is a really simple agent that doesn't know much about the world. It's like a lizard brain knee-jerk reaction, which is most of what you need for driving. Like, you can easily drive home being totally checked out, thinking about something else, right? Like a lot of driving is non-conscious. That's basically what this system is. But so it's kind of surprising how good these really simple machine learning systems can be for a lot of tasks. And they can seem like they're smarter than they actually are, just because they work really well 99% of the time. But then, in the 1% of the time when they do something totally crazy that you didn't expect, that can shake you out of the illusion that it's doing some intelligent behavior. So the way we think about agents in general in machine learning is we have this thing we call the agent. We have this environment which is changing, and the agent interacts with the environment through actions. So it affects some change in the world. And then the environment gives us some feedback, which we call like a new state. So the agent has eyes and it observes the state change. Sometimes it doesn't observe the total state, like there might be things going on that we don't observe. And then we also get reward, and that can just be thought of as part of the state. So, a simple way of modeling an agent is just with a neural network, which takes in some input state and outputs an action. In the reinforcement learning field, this is called a policy network. And the distinction from standard machine learning is that the agent has multiple interactions with the environment. And if the agent wants to be smart about things, it might take actions to get it at a certain location in the environment with high reward, rather than maximizing reward at every step or something like that. So with ChatGPT and this autonomous vehicle, you can think of the agent as just a really simple neural network, which is responding to each input individually and in a very quick lizard brain sort of way. And so the big there's lots of criticisms of these models, and trying to explain why these simple models can't do things that we expect them to do, and why they fail, or what are the limits. So, a lot of these big AI companies just argue that we need more data, more computers, more data to train these agents to be smarter. And then there's some pushback in the community saying, oh, we need to be smarter about how the agents are organized. So one common criticism of machine learning is, there's no symbolic reasoning. It's all based on these little neurons. If you want to learn how to do complicated things like math, you need more logical structure in the network rather than just these knee-jerk reactions. So I find that kind of compelling. However, the big companies are investing in agents where they try to reason out about math problems. My good friend is a math PhD who has been working for one of these companies trying to come up with math problems that are difficult for the AI agents to reason through. And the AI companies pay for these problems because they can use it to train their model to reason better about things. So I'm not totally convinced that AI agents lack symbolic reasoning because language is symbolic and these reasoning agents try to address this. But I really like this idea that the AI agents lack world models, and that explains a lot of the failures that we see in them. So Gary Marcus is a famous computer scientist who's written a few op-eds in the New York Times recently about this. And he gives examples where if you ask ChatGPT to play chess, it proposes incorrect moves because it doesn't have a model of chess. And then even with tic-tac-toe, if you say that you're using X's and Y's instead of X's and O's, the model gets confused and it gives incorrect answers, and he's able to beat tic-tac-toe. So these are kind of simple examples where the model messes up, and I think his idea that he calls them cognitive models. A language model doesn't have a cognitive model of the world that it can manipulate, but humans do this all the time. They kind of cogitate over things and they run simulations in their heads, and I think this is one of the things that's missing from a lot of the AI systems today, certainly from language models. The agents are kind of getting there, and that's a gray area. I don't know yet. So here's another example. I asked Google's Veo 3, the video generator, to show me a video of a graduate student working on a laptop while surfing in Hawaii. And he's giving me a very good video. The quality is actually better than what it is showing here. Yeah, so but the point is that these video generation models are kind of bad with physics. And so you can't really see it, but the leash is kind of there, but then it disappears. The fins, of course, are sticking up on the board. But it looks great, right? So if you just glance at it, it's fine. But obviously this thing doesn't know about physics, and it's not able to reason in the same way that humans would be able to. So this is an example of, the video generation model doesn't totally understand physics. How do we get there? I'm not sure, but okay. So this is the idea of world models. If an agent has a model of the world, and it might be multiple models of the world, then it can imagine things, it can plan, etc. Often this is computationally expensive, but as a human, I feel like this is, certainly what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And there's some evidence that we do a lot of this even subconsciously. So I want to go back to this image. So, whenever I'm driving now and I see some weird signs, I start thinking about, oh, how would a self-driving car deal with the situation? So here's a 2-lane road, which has 2 left lane closed, right lane closed. There's clearly a bus driving on the road. What's going on? Like, how should a self-driving car reason about this situation? If it was really strict, it would say, okay, the road is closed because, the left lane is closed, the right lane is closed. But I immediately start thinking about, okay, what idiot, like put these signs here, like I have a mental model of whatever person was hanging these signs, and I immediately get angry at them for doing something that is confusing and annoying to drivers. So I have a hard time imagining that, any of these AI models is going to be able to think in the same way about a situation like this. Like you have to, my reasoning process is that, okay, some human made a mistake because that's what humans do. And you just kind of have to roll with the flow. And it's hard for me to like see how a language model can do this. Of course, I put this in Google Gemini, and it actually gave a very reasonable response. It said, "Oh, you proceed with caution." So I don't know exactly. These agents are very good, even in situations where you wouldn't expect them to. But I'm pretty sure that that model is not doing the same thing that I'm doing when I'm thinking about this. Which is modeling human behavior and thinking about how other people think about things. So yeah, the idea of a world model is you're coming up with some predictions about how the environment will react to your actions. So, as an agent, I know that if I perform some action in some situation, I can predict how the world will respond. Like if I do something ridiculous, people might laugh, that sort of thing. And I think that that's useful because it allows you to run simulations in your head forward in time and consider the consequences of your actions. So there's a really nice paper by David Ha and Jürgen Schmidhuber. Schmidhuber is one of these famous AI people that's been working with neural networks for decades. And the subline, it's called World Models. The subtext is, can agents learn inside their own dreams? And they play with these video games, the car racer game where you control a little car and you try to race around the track, and a simple version of Doom, the classic shooter. And so they have this world model, which, you have this loop of a controller which controls the self-driving car. And then you have a world model that views how the game reacts to the actions of the controller. And it learns to model what happens in the game. So this world model is just a neural network. It takes in the current state and the action of the controller and predicts what happens in the next state. And it basically learns the video game, like how the video game works. And what they show is that, okay, you turn off the environment, so the agent is now sleeping, and the controller can interact with this world model, it's dreaming, and you can actually train the controller to improve itself by running these little simulations in your head. And I think that's a pretty good model of how dreams work. We're running these simulations in our head. We have this world model of how people react to our actions, and we're training our emotional responses, our knee-jerk reactions to these things. So I really like this idea. This is a great paper. I encourage you to go to the demo, and you can actually play in the dream state of both these games. It's very blurry because it was 10 years ago, and the image generating things are not quite there. So this is in the dream state, and if you actually press left and right, you can control where the car goes off the track. It's a very cool idea. So Jürgen Schmidhuber also had proposed this idea that language models, basically the base language models, not necessarily the agents, are world models of the internet. So it's basically predicting if you give this prompt to Reddit or Stack Overflow, the language model basically is a approximation of what you would expect in that question and answer session. Also Google search. And, it might be wrong. It's a crude approximation of how the internet actually works, but it's a very fast approximation that is quite useful in many situations. So in this other paper, Schmidt-Huber argues that, really intelligent agents, evolving beyond the lizard brain of LLMs, have access to multiple world models. So you have models of how people will interact here, how people will respond to your actions, how physics works, how your car responds to you. And you learn up this collection of world models, you learn how to prompt them and use the results in your thinking. So if I want to know how my actions will affect my friends, I can run these simulations in my head. If I give them a gift, will they be happy? Will they like this gift? That sort of thing. So I think modern agents that trillions of dollars are being invested in these AI agents that the big companies are creating. It's not just because they have these LLMs, it's because they're building these agents that can break down problems and use tools like world models. And they think this is the path to really useful AI methods. But this is very new and we're not quite there yet. So some of the AI research questions that I've just been kind of thinking about, and I think a lot of people are thinking about working in this agent space are, what kind of tools or world models do agents need for different applications? How do you learn world models on the fly? How do you learn to query the world models once you have them? And how do you decide on a computational budget? Because running these simulations in your head is very expensive. How do humans do it? How should new agents do it? Okay. So I have 10 minutes left. All of this is to lead up to this idea that world models is basically what everyone's doing in science. Science is all about building these models of the world so that we can make predictions about how real world interactions will go. Wet lab experiments or any type of experiments in the real world are expensive, so things that can be approximated with computation are super useful. Some experiments are just impossible, like how do we predict what will happen with climate change? We only get one shot, we can't run multiple real experiments, so we have to use computation to try and predict what will happen. And all these world models are inherently a crude approximation of what's happening in the real world. So I find comfort in this because a lot of what I do in my group is develop machine learning approximations to really hard, basically machine learning world models for science applications. And often these are not as accurate as more mechanistic models that people in science are working on. But if they're computationally more efficient, they can still be very useful. So briefly, I spend about half my time working on weather and climate these days. A lot of the big internet companies are developing models for this, like on the global scale. But my students and I have found that modeling weather and climate in Hawaii is really interesting because it's a kind of there's a lot of variability in the weather, and there's a lot of good data. And it's much a smaller scale where you can test out a lot of these ideas. So, for example, we have one project where we're predicting using high resolution satellite data, predicting where the clouds will be over Hawaii. This is important for energy applications, as we have more and more solar on the grid. So we did this about 6 years ago, and entered a few competitions from the Department of Energy to predict solar irradiance for energy applications. This is all using satellite data, but the way weather forecasting works is a literal world model where you simulate the atmosphere over the entire globe. You go about 2 weeks out, and then all weather forecasts that you get from the internet or your phone come from these big computational simulations. Unfortunately for Hawaii, the grid is really coarse. And so you have lots of hyper-local weather patterns here in Hawaii. I mean, we're here in Manoa, which has the most extreme rainfall gradient of anywhere I know. And that's covered by this one giant grid cell, right? So obviously this doesn't capture a lot of the patterns in Hawaii. So one of the things that we've been looking at is using these image generating AI models to do super resolution, going from these coarse weather forecasts to super high resolution satellite images. And again, this is all probabilistic, so you can generate thousands of samples. This is the data generation method, like how it looks like. And we can generate 1,000 samples, and then we can compute statistics over that, such as what is the probability that all the solar plants on the island are covered by clouds at the same time, which would cause a huge spike in energy. And we're also looking at precipitation and wind. So this is important for disaster forecasting. You know, what is the probability that this entire rainfall basin gets a certain amount of rain at the same time, or within a short period of time, and we can predict the stream flow level. So this is work in progress with Giuseppe Torri and Atmospheric Sciences. But I think it's very exciting, and I haven't seen anyone use this for flood forecasting yet. So we're hoping to be the first. So again, this is the input over here, this really coarse resolution weather forecast from the government. And then you know, each sample we get is really highly detailed, and we can generate thousands of these samples and then compute aggregate statistics. We're doing the same for climate and looking at monthly rainfall for climate downscaling. But I really want to get to some preliminary work that we're doing in the microbiome. So the scientific questions that we're looking at for microbiome science are kind of the classic question of how does the microbiome relate to host health? But with Anthony and Nicole, we've been looking at the structure of microbiomes and how are they structured, how stable are they, and are there keystone species in the microbiome that affect this stability? So this is, you know, from just an example paper where, you know, a human subject showed some variability in their microbiome over time. So we want to come up with models for this. Speaking to the first part, we're looking at dimensionality reduction methods, specifically like self-supervised foundation models for microbiome data. We've played around with the Earth Microbiome Project. to build foundation models from that, which can help do dimensionality reduction. So basically a glorified PCA. We also have, we published a paper on like a neural network model that used the phylogenetic tree to kind of constrain the structure of the neural network. The goal being to reduce the amount of data that you need for learning these microbiome host phenotype relationships. But the project that we're working on currently is we've been looking at this paper called C-Node from 2022, which basically tries to learn the relationship between which species are in a sample and the relative abundance of those species. And the way they do this, they use a kind of fancy neural network technique called a neural ODE model, or neural ordinary differential equation. It models the dynamics of the microbe ecology. So given any relative abundance of a set of microbes, this model defines how the abundances will change over time. And the idea of this paper is if you have some fixed set of samples, metagenomic samples, you treat those as fixed points in the dynamics, which is a big assumption. And then you learn this mapping between what species are in that sample and the relative abundance that you output. So if you had nice time series of the relative abundance over time, it'd be much easier to learn these dynamics. You'd fit one of these ecology models. But all we have is the snapshot in time. So we're going to assume that these are stable points in that dynamical system. And this neural network model allows you to try to learn this mapping. So it's a very ambitious paper, but we thought the ideas were very interesting, especially because there was this follow-up paper which fit this sort of model to data and then used it to simulate what would happen if you removed one of these species. So if you remove one of these species and the structure, the relative abundance of the microbe community totally changes. In the paper, they say, oh, this is a keystone species because it has a big effect on the structure of the community. So I want to point out that this is basically a world model. Instead of doing some, wet lab experiments and getting time series, you're coming up with this computational model to do these experiments computationally. Of course, the accuracy of this model determines whether or not this is very useful. So they made some big claims in the paper. We replicated the results. We were very not impressed with being able to replicate. Basically, this assumption that you converge to a certain relative abundance, in their experiments, they were not converging. They were reaching some point, but they did not converge. And so one of the big assumptions of the model was just totally off. But it got us thinking about different models, and we've been playing around with other things. So we moved to simulating microbial communities because it gives us a lot more control over our experiments. So I think this is my last slide. This is some preliminary results that I've been doing with a master's student, Levi Davis. We have 256 species. We generate dynamics from a generalized Lotka-Volterra model with random parameters. And then we randomly sample a subset of the species from this 256. We run the dynamics forward until it converges. That's our observed data that we give to our machine learning models to try and learn these dynamics. So we implemented the C-Node model which basically does the same as linear regression. If you take, the input set of species and the output relative abundance, and then you fit a linear regression model, it does basically the exact same. So C-node is not very impressive. But Levi came up with some more complicated models that do better when you have big training sets, which are a little unrealistic for actual applications. And this shouldn't be too surprising because it's a more complicated model. It has more data available for it to train. This is 1,000 samples. So if you have 10,000 samples, you can do really well with these more complicated models. So, this isn't ready for prime time. It's not particularly useful to actual scientists working in the field. But if you happen to have 10,000 microbial samples, we have a model for you that will be able to, this is a highly idealized, simple model of microbe dynamics, but we have something that works. And we had lots of ideas about, the types of interactions between microbes that we could model with this, and we could incorporate, we could kind of control how those interactions work by controlling the model. So, thank you all. I'm a little over time, but this is my group, and I appreciate you listening.